The cockpit was filling with smoke. 23-year-old Eugene "Red" Tobin could barely see through the shattered canopy as German bullets tore through his Spitfire. Blood ran into his eyes. His hands trembled on the controls. Below him, the English Channel churned gray and cold. Above, 3 Messerschmitts circled back for the kill. His radio crackled with a desperate voice screaming his name, but Red couldn't answer. He was too busy trying to survive. And here's what nobody back in Los Angeles knew. If Red didn't make it home, the letter his mother would write to President Roosevelt could destroy the alliance between America and Britain before it truly began, because technically her son was a criminal who'd violated federal law to fight in a war that wasn't his. How did an American dance instructor from California end up bleeding out in British skies 15 months before Pearl Harbor? Why would hundreds of young Americans risk everything to die for strangers? And what really happened between Britain and America during World War II that Hollywood has never quite shown us? This isn't the story from the movies. This is what really happened when two nations that barely trusted each other somehow managed to save the world. May 1940. Red Tobin sat in his Los Angeles apartment reading the newspaper. The headlines were apocalyptic. France was collapsing. Hitler's Wehrmacht was steamrolling across Europe. Red taught the foxtrot and waltz to housewives at Arthur Murray Studios. He went to the beach on weekends, living the California dream. But suddenly, none of it seemed real compared to what was happening across the Atlantic. His roommate thought he was insane when Red announced he was going to Canada. "We're not at war," his friend protested. "It's not our problem." But Red had already decided. He wasn't alone. Across America, young men were looking at the same headlines and reaching the same conclusion. Somebody had to stop Hitler. The journey north was pure cloak and dagger. They told border officials they were visiting Canadian relatives. Behind the scenes, a secret committee run by World War I flying ace. Billy Bishop was quietly recruiting them. The FBI watched the border crossings. The State Department filed reports. But nobody stopped them, because while President Roosevelt couldn't publicly support Americans joining a foreign war, he privately understood that these volunteers might be exactly what Britain needed to survive. Red arrived in England in September 1940, right in the middle of the Battle of Britain. The country was being bombed every single night, London burned, and the RAF was bleeding to death in the skies. Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe had over 2,800 aircraft. The RAF had fewer than 700 operational fighters. The Germans had battle-hardened pilots who'd conquered Poland, Norway, and France. Many British pilots had less than 10 hours in a Spitfire before facing combat. Britain was losing pilots faster than they could train replacements. Young men would join squadrons on Monday and be dead by Friday. The British didn't know what to make of these Americans. The volunteers were loud, irreverent, and absolutely refused to follow military protocol. They got into fistfights with British officers. They played Glenn Miller records at full volume. They complained endlessly about British food. One pilot wrote home, "The English boil everything until it surrenders." They drove their commanders crazy. But when the scramble bell rang, these same Americans would run to their Spitfires and fight like men possessed. Because they'd seen photographs of British children sleeping in subway stations while bombs fell overhead. They'd heard Edward R. Murrow's radio broadcasts from burning London rooftops. They knew that if Britain fell, America would be next. By February, there were enough Americans to form 71 Squadron, the first Eagle Squadron. They wore RAF blue with a special shoulder patch showing an American eagle. When they walked into village pubs, locals bought them pints and thanked them for coming. British families invited them for Sunday dinner. Young women flocked to dances where the Americans taught them to jitterbug. These boys from Brooklyn and Dallas became celebrities in their corner of England. Red Tobin shot down his first German aircraft on August 11, 1941. That night, he wrote to his mother. The letter took 3 weeks to reach Los Angeles. Dear Mom, I can't tell you where I am or what I'm doing, but I want you to know I'm doing something that matters. I couldn't sit home teaching dance steps while the world burned. I need you to understand why I left. I love you, Red. His mother saved that letter. She'd read it over and over in the months ahead, trying to hold on to her son's voice. 6 weeks later, Red was dead, shot down during a fighter sweep over France. 24 years old, never married, never had children, never saw Pearl Harbor or D-Day or Victory. His body washed ashore 3 days later. A French fisherman found him and buried him in secret because the Germans would have thrown him in a mass grave. After the war, that fisherman led Red Squadron mates to the spot. They gave him a proper burial with full military honors, an American flag, and a British flag draped across his coffin. Vernon Shorty Keogh, the circus acrobat, died 2 weeks after Red, engine failure over the channel. He radioed his position before going down, but rescue boats never found him. The channel kept him. By the time the Eagle Squadrons transferred to the U.S. Army Air Forces in September 1942, 71 Americans had been killed fighting for Britain. Their names are carved into a memorial at Grosvenor Square in London. Most Americans have never heard of them. While these young men were dying in British skies, something equally dramatic was happening politically. President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill were building one of history's most consequential friendships. And Roosevelt was doing it while publicly promising Americans he'd never send their sons to fight in a foreign war. Churchill understood Americans better than most Britons. His mother was American, Jenny Jerome from Brooklyn. He knew Americans sympathized with Britain, but they also remembered World War I. They remembered the trenches and gas attacks. They wanted no part of another European bloodbath. The two leaders began corresponding in September 1930, just days after Germany invaded Poland. At first, the letters were formal, cautious. But as the war worsened and Churchill became Prime Minister in May 1940, the letters became more desperate, more honest. Churchill laid out Britain's situation brutally. We're running out of ships, we're running out of pilots, we're running out of money. The British Empire was on the verge of bankruptcy. They'd been buying American weapons on a cash-and-carry basis, but the cash was almost gone. Roosevelt faced a dilemma. Britain desperately needed help, but the Neutrality Acts forbade loans to nations at war. So he came up with something brilliant. In December 1940, he held a press conference and explained his idea using a simple story. Suppose your neighbor's house catches fire and he asks to borrow your garden hose. You don't argue about payment. You hand him the hose so he can put out the fire before it spreads to your house. Then he gives it back. Maybe it's damaged, but you've saved both houses. That was Lend-Lease, passed by Congress in March 1941, 9 months before Pearl Harbor. America would lend weapons, equipment, food, and supplies to any nation whose defense was vital to U.S. security. Between 1941 and 1940, America sent over $50 billion worth of equipment to the Allies. In today's money, that's over $800 billion. Tanks by the thousands. Aircraft by the tens of thousands. Everything an army needs to fight. Those supplies had to cross the Atlantic through waters crawling with German U-boats. The Battle of the Atlantic became the longest continuous campaign of the entire war. Convoys would steam east while German submarines hunted them. Men died in freezing water when their ships were torpedoed. Oil tankers exploded in balls of flame, but the convoys kept coming. Month after month, they kept coming. Churchill later wrote that Lend-Lease was the most unsordid act in the history of any nation. Some historians argue it wasn't altruism, that America was paid back through economic benefits. They're not wrong, but they're missing the point. Roosevelt didn't have to do it. Congress could have said no. The American people could have demanded we stay out, but we didn't. Then came December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor changed everything. Japan attacked. Germany declared war on the United States 4 days later. Suddenly, we weren't lending equipment to other people's wars. We were fighting for our own survival. Churchill was in Washington when he heard the news. He was staying at the White House as Roosevelt's guest. He later wrote that after the initial shock, he went to bed that night and slept the sleep of the saved and thankful. He knew that with America's industrial might fully committed, victory was now possible. Roosevelt and Churchill met 9 times during the war. They stayed in each other's homes. They argued about strategy, sometimes bitterly. British military leaders thought American generals were inexperienced. American officers thought the British were too cautious. But through all the arguments, Roosevelt and Churchill maintained their friendship, and that friendship held the alliance together. June 6, 1944, D-Day, the invasion of Normandy. This is where we need to understand what really happened, because the truth is more interesting than any movie shows. Planning began in early 1940, a full year before the actual landing. A British general named Frederick Morgan assembled a planning staff mixing British and American officers. They worked for months studying every detail, the tides along the French coast, German fortifications, weather patterns, how to land tanks on a beach with no harbor. The British came up with an audacious solution: build artificial harbors called mulberries, massive floating platforms that could be towed across the channel. American engineers thought it was insane. They built them anyway, and they worked. When General Dwight Eisenhower was appointed the Supreme Allied Commander in December 1943, he made major changes. He expanded the invasion from 3 beaches to 5. But Eisenhower's real genius wasn't military strategy. It was political. He created a command structure that mixed British and American leaders at every level. His deputy was British Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder. The ground forces commander was British General Bernard Montgomery. The naval commander was British Admiral Bertram Ramsay. Eisenhower announced that anyone in his command who criticized the British or Americans would be immediately sent home. The alliance was more important than national pride. On June 5th, the invasion fleet assembled, over 5,000 ships, the largest armada in human history. Right there in the middle was an old American battleship called USS Texas. She'd been commissioned in 1940. By 1944, she was obsolete and outdated. The Navy wanted to scrap her, but her 14-inch guns could throw massive shells over 12 miles inland. At 3 in the morning on June 6th, Texas took her position off Omaha Beach. As dawn broke, her guns opened fire. The concussion was so powerful it cracked bulkheads inside the ship. Crew members who forgot to open their mouths when the guns fired had their teeth cracked by the pressure. When the first American troops hit Omaha Beach at 6:30 a.m., they ran into a nightmare. German machine guns tore through the landing craft. Men were hit before reaching the sand. Bodies floated in the surf. Wounded men drowned in 3 feet of water. For 2 hours, the invasion at Omaha teetered on the edge of total failure. Texas's captain moved his ship closer to shore. So close, his navigator warned they might run aground. From that position, Texas's guns could hit the German bunkers directly. Shell after shell slammed into the cliffs. Slowly, the German fire decreased. American soldiers began moving off the beach. Texas had fired 2 rounds. Her crew hadn't slept in 36 hours, but they'd helped save the invasion. Right beside Texas was HMS Glasgow, a British cruiser hammering German positions. British minesweepers had cleared the channels. British aircraft provided cover. At Gold Beach and Sword Beach, British and Canadian troops fought their own desperate battles. By nightfall, over 156,000 Allied troops had landed in Normandy. About 73,000 were American. About 61,000 were British. About 21,000 were Canadian. Nearly 10,000 men were killed or wounded on the first day, but they held the beaches. The battle for Normandy lasted 11 weeks. British and Canadian forces around Caen faced the bulk of German armor. American forces broke through at St. Lo and swept across France. It wasn't America saving Europe or Britain doing the heavy lifting. It was coordinated strategy, each force making the other's mission possible. By August 25th, Paris was liberated. By September, Allied armies were on Germany's border. The Wehrmacht was in retreat. The Third Reich was doomed, and it had been accomplished by genuine partnership between Britain, America, Canada, and the other allies. So, what happened after the war? How did we get from that extraordinary partnership to today's arguments about who deserves credit? Simple. America emerged as the dominant global power. Our cities hadn't been bombed. Our factories were intact. Britain was exhausted and broke. Hollywood became the world's dominant entertainment industry. American movies told American stories with American heroes. That wasn't conspiracy, it was market forces. Films like Saving Private Ryan told powerful, true stories about American sacrifice. But they were incomplete. British contributions gradually faded from American popular memory. Young Americans today often don't know that Britain stood alone against Hitler for over a year before Pearl Harbor. They don't know about the Battle of Britain or the Eagle Squadron volunteers who died in British uniforms. But some British accounts also minimize America's contribution. They focus so heavily on British suffering that they barely acknowledge American involvement. This view is also incomplete. Over 16 million Americans served, over 400,000 died. We fought a two-ocean war simultaneously. American industrial production was essential. By 1904, America was producing more war material than all other nations combined. But the real story isn't about keeping score. The real story is what human beings accomplished working together against evil. Red Tobin didn't fly across the Atlantic to win arguments about credit. He went because he saw photographs of British children in bomb shelters and couldn't turn away. The sailors on USS Texas didn't worry about how history would remember them. They fired their guns to save Americans dying on Omaha Beach. Roosevelt and Churchill didn't maintain their friendship because they agreed on everything. They did it because they understood that neither nation could win alone. The Eagle Squadron Memorial at Grosvenor Square has a simple inscription. They died for what they believed, the freedom of the world, not American freedom, not British freedom, the freedom of the world. Red Tobin's mother eventually received that telegram telling her son had died in action. She also received his RAF wings, his pilot's logbook, and a letter from his squadron commander explaining how bravely he'd fought. She kept them until she died decades later. When her grandson cleaned out her apartment, he found them in a box. The wings were tarnished. The logbook was water-stained, but she'd kept them. That grandson is 70 years old now. He's never met anyone else whose relative flew with the Eagle Squadron. Most Americans have never heard the story, but he knows his grandfather was part of something important, something that transcended borders and nationalities, something worth dying for, the freedom of the world. When Roosevelt died in April 1940, just weeks before victory in Europe, Churchill wept. He'd lost his friend and partner. He told Parliament, "In Franklin Roosevelt there died the greatest American friend we have ever known." The men and women who lived through World War II paid a terrible price. Over 400,000 Americans dead. Over 450,000 British dead. Millions wounded. Families shattered, but they bore it together. And that partnership, with all its flaws and tensions, saved the world from darkness. That's not an American story or a British story. It's a human story. British pilots who flew until they couldn't fly anymore. American volunteers who crossed the Atlantic before their country was even at war. Sailors from both nations who faced U-boats in the freezing Atlantic. Soldiers from both nations who stormed the beaches of Normandy. They were partners, imperfect, sometimes quarrelsome, but genuine partners. And together they changed the course of history. Today, we face different challenges than our grandparents faced 8 decades ago. But the fundamental lesson remains. Free nations are stronger together than apart. When democracies work together, respecting each other's contributions and sacrificing for each other's survival, nothing is impossible. Red Tobin understood this when he climbed into that Spitfire for the last time. The crew of USS Texas understood it when they sailed toward Omaha Beach. Roosevelt and Churchill understood it through every argument and disagreement. Remember them, honor them, learn from them. Because what they accomplished together is proof that when people look beyond their own interests and fight for something larger than themselves, they can save the world. That's what Red Tobin and 70 other Americans died proving. That's what the greatest generation, British and American alike, gave us. Not the arguments about credit, not the Hollywood versions, but the real thing, the partnership that saved civilization when it teetered on the edge of the abyss, not even saving the world, actually saving it.